My son shoved me down the stairs after I refused to co-sign his house. His wife smirked. Be useful for once, old man. So I destroyed them both. Now he's writing me from prison, begging for forgiveness. Hey, Reddit. So my own son shoved me down a flight of stairs because I wouldn't co-sign his mortgage, and his lovely wife stood there smirking and called me a useless old man. They thought I was just some pushover who'd eventually cave like I always did. They thought wrong. Very, very wrong. I'm 58 male, a retired HVAC technician from Ohio. Spent 32 years crawling through attics in the dead of summer, freezing in basements during winter, and fixing units in 100-degree heat so my family could have a decent life. I've got scars on my hands from sheet metal cuts and permanent calluses that'll never go away no matter how much lotion Katie buys me. Raised 2 kids, paid off my house, and saved for retirement the hard way. No inheritance from rich relatives, no lottery winnings, no lucky breaks. Just decades of honest work with my hands and a whole lot of 5 a.m. alarm clocks. My wife Linda passed away from cancer 8 years ago. That woman was the glue holding our whole family together. And when she left us, cracks started showing in places I never expected. She had this way of keeping everyone balanced, of seeing trouble coming before it arrived and heading it off at the pass. She could read people better than anyone I ever met. Without her, all those problems she would have caught early just kept growing into bigger problems. But I'm getting ahead of myself here. Let me tell you about my son Brandon, 32 male. From the moment that kid could talk, he had an excuse for everything. Failed a spelling test in 3rd grade? The teacher wrote the words on the board too small, and the classroom was too noisy to concentrate. Got benched during Little League? Coach was playing favorites with the kids whose parents donated more to the league. Didn't get invited to some birthday party? Those kids were all jerks anyway, and he didn't want to go. Nothing was ever his fault. Not once in 32 years has that kid looked in a mirror and said, maybe I could have done something differently. Maybe I bear some responsibility for what happened. Never. My wife Linda used to say he'd grow out of it. She'd tell me boys mature slower than girls, that he just needed time and patience. She was wrong about that one, God rest her soul. Some people never grow out of anything because nobody ever makes them face consequences. My daughter Katie, 29 female, is the complete opposite of her brother. Night and day, those two. Same parents, same household, same opportunities growing up, but completely different outcomes. Katie worked 2 jobs through college while maintaining a full course load and still finding time to volunteer at a food bank on weekends. Graduated with honors and had 3 job offers before she even walked across the stage to get her diploma. Now she runs her own accounting firm with a dozen employees and clients all over the Midwest. Built it from scratch starting in her apartment with just a laptop and a dream. She calls me every Sunday without fail, no matter how busy she is. Visits on holidays even when it means driving 4 hours each way through bad weather. Actually remembers my birthday without a Facebook reminder telling her. And she always plans something special. She's proof that I didn't completely fail as a parent. At least one of them turned out right. Brandon, on the other hand, bounced from job to job like a pinball machine after graduation. Couldn't hold down anything for more than 6 months. Sometimes not even 3 months before something would go wrong. Always had some drama with coworkers who didn't appreciate his contributions. Always had some conflict with management who felt threatened by his brilliant ideas. Always had some perfectly reasonable explanation for why this particular job just wasn't worthy of his extraordinary talents and why quitting was actually the smart move. The kid had a degree in business administration that he'd somehow stretched into 6 years of what I can only assume was mostly college parties and video games. 6 years for a 4-year degree, and he treated that diploma like it made him royalty walking among peasants. Like having a piece of paper meant he was too good for entry-level work, or paying his dues like everyone else. I remember when he was 22 and got fired from a job at an insurance company after just 10 weeks. He came home that night and told me and Linda the whole story, spinning it like he was the victim of some great injustice. His manager had unrealistic expectations and didn't understand modern work culture. His coworkers were toxic and threatened by fresh talent. The company was stuck in the past and unwilling to embrace new ideas. Linda listened to the whole thing and then asked him one simple question. What did your performance review say? Brandon got real quiet. Turned out he'd missed deadlines, showed up late repeatedly, and spent more time on his phone than doing actual work. But according to him, none of that mattered because the system was rigged against young people. Then he met Heather, 30 female. Now I try not to judge people too quickly. My wife Linda always said I was too cynical, too quick to see the worst in folks before giving them a fair chance. She was probably right about that, God rest her soul. But Heather set off alarm bells from the very first dinner Brandon brought her home for. Something about her just felt off to me from the start. I remember that night clear as yesterday. I'd made pot roast with all the trimmings because Brandon mentioned she appreciated home cooking. Set the good table, the one we used for holidays. Even lit a candle, which Linda would have appreciated. The whole time Heather was sitting at my dinner table, though, she wasn't really there for the meal or the conversation. Her eyes kept wandering around my house like she was appraising it for an estate sale, looking at the furniture, the fixtures, the square footage. Before we'd even finished eating, she asked how much my property was worth in the current market. I thought maybe she was making conversation, so I gave a vague answer. Then she asked what my retirement accounts looked like. Then she asked whether I had life insurance and who the beneficiaries were. Then she asked if I owned any other properties or had any investments I was sitting on. I thought maybe she was just socially awkward, maybe coming from a different background where these topics were normal dinner conversation. Maybe she didn't realize these were incredibly personal questions to ask someone you just met. Nope. Looking back, she was shopping, taking inventory, running calculations in her head about what I was worth and how she could get access to it. Heather came from money. Not earned money, mind you, but inherited money that her parents had mostly blown through by the time she graduated high school. Bad investments in get-rich-quick schemes, expensive tastes they couldn't actually afford, keeping up appearances in a social circle that never really cared about them anyway. She grew up in a big house in a fancy neighborhood and went to private schools with kids whose families actually had money. But by the time she was an adult, all that was left were the expensive tastes and a minimum wage budget to fund them. And she saw Brandon as her ticket back to the lifestyle she thought she deserved. Problem was, Brandon was broke. More than broke, actually. He was drowning in debt from credit cards he'd maxed out on stupid purchases, like gaming systems and designer clothes and expensive restaurants he couldn't afford. Plus, student loans from those 6 years of academic meandering that he'd never made a serious dent in. So Heather's calculating eyes eventually landed on me and stayed there like a target lock. The wedding planning was a circus that should have told me everything I needed to know about the years ahead. They wanted the works, everything they'd ever seen in a movie or on social media. The fancy venue at some country club, neither of them had any connection to whatsoever. The designer dress that cost more than my first car. The catering from some high-end restaurant, because regular catering was beneath them, apparently. The live band instead of a DJ, because DJs were for cheap weddings. The destination bachelor and bachelorette parties in locations I'd never even heard of. Professional photographer, professional videographer, flowers flown in from overseas, the whole 9 yards, and then some. When they presented me with their budget of $40,000 and asked me to cover half, I almost choked on my morning coffee. $20,000 so my son could impress a bunch of people he barely knew with a party they'd forget about in a month. I'd worked overtime for years to save that kind of money, and they wanted it blown in a single evening of toasts and dance floor photos. I offered $5,000, which I thought was pretty generous all things considered. Brandon still owed me $8,000 from various loans over the years that we both knew were never getting repaid. Money for car repairs that magically turned into money for a new gaming console. Money for rent when he was between jobs that somehow became money for a vacation to clear his head from all the job hunting stress. Money for an emergency that turned out to be concert tickets he really wanted. We both knew that $8,000 was gone forever, but we pretended otherwise because that's what family does, I guess. Heather threw an absolute fit when I wouldn't budge past $5,000. Called me cheap right there in my own living room, in my own house that I'd paid off with my own hands. Said I was embarrassing her in front of her family and their society friends. Said I clearly didn't love my son if I wasn't willing to invest in his future happiness. Brandon just sat there nodding along like a bobblehead doll while his fiancée tore into his father, never once defending me or telling her to calm down or suggesting maybe she was being unreasonable. Just nodded and let it happen. They ended up scaling back the wedding when Heather's parents couldn't cough up more than a few thousand either. Turns out the family money really was gone, and they'd been living on credit and appearances just like their daughter. But that resentment Heather felt toward me for not funding her dream wedding day, that never went away. It just festered like an untreated infection, growing worse and more toxic with time. Every holiday dinner after that, I could feel her eyes on me from across the table, calculating, waiting, planning her next move. For 5 years after the wedding, I watched my son slowly disappear. The Brandon I raised, flawed as he was, at least had some spark of independence to him, some personality of his own, some opinions that were actually his, even if those opinions included constant excuse-making and responsibility dodging. The Brandon who was married to Heather became just a shell of that person. A puppet who repeated whatever she told him to say and did whatever she told him to do without question. She controlled absolutely everything in their marriage. Their finances, which were a mess of maxed credit cards and overdue bills, but somehow always his fault for not earning enough. Their social calendar, which revolved entirely around people she wanted to impress and events where she could show off. Their opinions on politics, culture, family matters, what restaurants were acceptable, what cars they should drive, what neighborhood they deserved to live in. Brandon didn't have thoughts anymore. He had whatever Heather's thoughts were, delivered through his mouth like he was a ventriloquist dummy. And those shared opinions increasingly centered around one theme: what I owed them. See, here's the thing about my house. It's a 3-bedroom ranch in a decent suburb. Nothing fancy or impressive, just a modest place I bought in the early 90s when prices were still reasonable for a working man with a steady job. But the neighborhood went up in value over the years as the city expanded outward. Young professionals moved in and fixed up the older homes. Good schools attracted families willing to pay premium prices. What I paid $120,000 for back then is worth close to $400,000 now, just sitting there appreciating while I mow the lawn and clean the gutters. Between the house equity and my retirement savings and my late wife's life insurance payout that I'd barely touched because it felt wrong to spend it, I was sitting pretty comfortably for a man my age. I wasn't rich by any stretch of imagination. I still clipped coupons for groceries and drove a 10-year-old truck that got the job done. But I was secure. I could retire without worrying about ending up on the street. And to people like Heather who'd grown up expecting wealth and ended up with nothing, that security looked like opportunity waiting to be exploited. The asks started small at first. Could I help with their car payment this month because things were unexpectedly tight? Could I cover their electric bill while Brandon was between jobs again? Could I loan them a couple thousand for a vacation because they really needed a break from all the stress of trying to make ends meet? Just this once. They'd pay me back soon. Every time I said yes, I was just priming the pump for the next request, training them to expect more and more, establishing a pattern where my money was their backup plan whenever their own poor planning caught up with them. And every time I said no, I got the cold shoulder treatment for weeks or months. No phone calls, no holiday visits, passive-aggressive comments through the family grapevine about how sad it was that some people cared more about money than their own flesh and blood. My daughter Katie warned me repeatedly about what was happening. She saw the pattern way before I was willing to admit it to myself. She'd pull me aside at family gatherings after Brandon and Heather had made yet another thinly veiled request for cash, disguised as small talk, and tell me straight up that they were using me, that I needed to set firm boundaries and stick to them, that I was teaching them they could treat me like a personal ATM with no consequences. But he was my son, my flesh and blood, my only boy. How do you give up on your own kid? How do you look at the child you raised from birth and say, "Enough, I'm done trying to help you"? Linda would have known what to do. She always knew how to be firm without being cruel. But Linda was gone, and I was just fumbling around in the dark trying to keep some version of family together. Turns out, giving up on your own kid becomes pretty easy when he shoves you down a flight of stairs. It was a Sunday afternoon in March when everything finally went to hell. The weather was just starting to warm up, that weird Ohio spring where it's 40 degrees one day and 70 the next. I'd been doing laundry and some light cleaning, enjoying a quiet day with nothing on the calendar and nowhere to be. Brandon and Heather showed up unannounced around 2 in the afternoon. This was their usual style by now. They never called ahead to ask if I was free or if it was a good time for a visit, because they knew I might say I was busy or make an excuse. Harder to turn someone away when they're already standing on your porch with expectant looks on their faces and a car parked in your driveway. I let them in because what else was I going to do? Leave my own son standing outside on the porch? I offered them coffee and some cookies I had in the pantry, and we sat down in my living room, same as dozens of visits before. But I could immediately tell something was different about this particular visit. Something bigger was coming. Heather had that look she gets right before she asks for something significant. Eyes too bright, smile stretched too wide, voice pitched just a little higher than her normal calculating tone. Brandon was fidgeting like a nervous kid, waiting outside the principal's office, picking at his fingernails and avoiding eye contact with me. After some painful small talk about the weather and some TV shows I don't watch and how their jobs were going, his answer was vague because he'd recently been let go again, I found out later. Heather finally got to the actual point of their visit. Turns out, they'd found their dream home. She pulled out her phone and started showing me pictures like she was a real estate agent making a presentation to investors. A four-bedroom colonial in one of those fancy new developments on the edge of town. The kind of place with an HOA that regulates what color you can paint your mailbox and what kind of holiday decorations are acceptable, and charges monthly fees that cost more than my first mortgage payment did. List price, $450,000. Now, I knew roughly what Brandon and Heather made when Brandon was actually employed, which wasn't often. His jobs never paid more than mid-30s when he had one, and Heather worked part-time as a receptionist at a dental office for maybe $15 an hour. Their combined income was perhaps 70 grand a year on a good year when Brandon was working. They had credit card debt piled up from years of living beyond their means. They had 2 car payments on vehicles nicer than anything I'd ever owned. They had a history of late payments and collection calls that made their credit scores look like bowling scores. There was absolutely no way any sane mortgage lender in this country was going to approve them for a $450,000 house, unless someone with better credit and actual assets co-signed the loan and took on the risk. That someone, they had decided, was going to be me. Heather laid it all out like she was presenting a Fortune 500 business proposal, complete with talking points she'd clearly rehearsed. They'd already talked to a mortgage broker who specialized in creative financing solutions for people with challenged credit. If I co-signed the loan and put up my house as additional collateral, they could get approved despite their credit history and lack of down payment. All I had to do was sign some paperwork and show up at closing. They'd handle everything else from there. Easy peasy, no big deal. They'd never miss a single payment, she promised, with that too wide smile that didn't reach her eyes. They'd build equity that would eventually benefit the whole family, including me. This was an investment in their future, in my future grandchildren's future, if they ever decided to have kids. I'd barely even know I was involved after the closing. Just some signatures on some documents, and everyone would finally be happy and we could all move forward as a real family. I sat there listening to this pitch, watching Heather's animated hand gestures and Brandon's nervous nodding along, and all I could think about was the 32 years I spent crawling through crawl spaces and balancing on rooftops in bad weather to pay off my own house. The decades of careful saving and doing without luxuries, so there'd be something left for retirement. The life insurance money from my wife Linda, that I'd sworn to use responsibly, to honor her memory by not being reckless with the financial security she'd helped build. They wanted me to put all of that at risk. Everything I'd worked for my entire adult life. Everything Linda and I had built together through sacrifice and discipline. They wanted me to bet it all on their ability to make payments on a house they clearly couldn't afford, knowing full well that when they defaulted, not if, but when, it would be my house on the chopping block, my retirement, my security, my future. Gone. I said no. Not maybe, not let me think about it, and get back to you next week. Not we'll see what we can work out. Just no. A complete sentence. Final answer. No explanation needed. Heather's expression went from that fake sweetness to pure cold venom in about half a second flat. The mask dropped completely, and I saw the real person underneath. She started in on me about how I was sitting on all this money and property, while my own son struggled to get ahead in life, how I was selfish and small-minded and unable to see the big picture, how I'd clearly never wanted Brandon to succeed at anything, and this refusal was just more proof of what she'd always suspected about me and my priorities. Then she played her trump card. She said my wife Linda would be ashamed of me if she could see from heaven how I was treating my only son. That Linda would never have let Brandon struggle like this. That Linda always supported her children no matter what, using my dead wife, the woman I'd loved for 30 years and still missed every single day, to manipulate me into a bad financial decision, invoking her name like she was some weapon to be deployed in their scheme. That's when I knew there was absolutely no bottom to how low this woman would go to get what she wanted from me. I told them both to leave, told them to get out of my house immediately. I was done being their piggy bank, done being guilted into terrible decisions, done pretending this was a normal, healthy family relationship when it was clearly just a long con with better disguises and family photos. Brandon stood up from the couch, and for a brief moment I thought maybe he was going to apologize for his wife's behavior. Maybe, just maybe, some part of my actual son was still in there somewhere, buried under all those years of Heather's influence and his own weakness and excuses. Maybe he'd finally see what was happening to us and snap out of it. Stand up to his wife for once in his pathetic life. Choose his own father over her greed. Instead, he got right up in my face and started yelling, his finger jabbing toward my chest with each accusation, calling me pathetic and bitter and old, saying I was going to die alone in this house, clutching all my money, while nobody who actually cared about me was left to mourn, that I was a failure as a father who'd never given him the support he needed to succeed at anything, that I'd always favored Katie over him and never given him a fair chance. So I told him the truth, told him to grow up and take some responsibility for once, told him that real men don't blame their fathers for their own failures at 32 years old, told him that if he wanted a nice house in a fancy neighborhood, maybe he should try holding down a job for more than 6 months instead of expecting everyone else to fund his lifestyle. That's when he shoved me. I was standing at the top of my basement stairs. The door was open because I'd been doing laundry earlier that morning and hadn't gotten around to closing it yet. One hard shove to my chest with both his hands, and I went backwards into empty air where floor should have been. 14 steps. I counted them later when I was lying in the hospital giving my statement to the police detective. 14 wooden steps between the main floor and the concrete basement floor. I don't remember hitting every single one on the way down, but I remember enough. The jarring impact on my shoulder against the wall, the crack of my wrist as I tried to catch myself on the railing, the final thud when I hit the bottom and everything went white with pain. I remember lying there on that cold concrete floor, struggling to breathe, looking up at the rectangle of light at the top of the stairs. I remember seeing Brandon standing there frozen, his face white as a sheet like he couldn't believe what he'd just done with his own hands. And then I remember Heather appearing next to him, looking down at me crumpled at the bottom of those stairs. I watched her expression shift from surprise to calculation to something that might have been satisfaction. She said, with that smirk on her face that I'll remember until the day I die, "Be useful for once, old man. Just sign the papers, and we can pretend this never happened. Be useful for once." I told them to get out or I was calling the police. Brandon started panicking then, suddenly remembering I was his father and he might have just committed a serious felony. He tried to come down the stairs to help me, playing the concerned son act, but Heather grabbed his arm and pulled him back. She said something about how I was probably fine, probably exaggerating for sympathy like always. Then they left. I heard the front door close and their car start and pull away, and I was alone at the bottom of my stairs with my phone sitting in the kitchen where I'd left it. I lay there on that basement floor for probably 20 minutes before I could get myself to move. I crawled up those stairs on my hands and one good knee because I couldn't put any weight on my right leg. By the time I reached the top, I was drenched in sweat and shaking. I got to my phone and called Katie first. Then 911. The ambulance came. The paramedics were gentle and professional as they loaded me onto a stretcher. Then the police came and they asked questions. Lots of questions. A fractured hip requiring surgery to insert pins and plates. A broken wrist requiring its own set of pins. Bruised ribs that made every single breath feel like getting stabbed. At 58 years old, those aren't injuries you just bounce back from with ice and ibuprofen and a week on the couch. I spent 4 days in the hospital before and after the hip surgery, then another 3 weeks in a rehabilitation facility learning to walk properly again. Lots of time lying in beds staring at ceilings. Lots of time thinking about what had happened and how I'd ended up here. About my son and the years of excuses I'd made for his behavior. About how I'd let Heather worm her way into our family and poison everything she touched. Katie visited me every single day. She'd bring me coffee and crossword puzzles and updates on what was happening with the investigation. She never once said I told you so, even though she'd been warning me about Brandon and Heather for years. That's the difference between my two kids right there. One visits you in the hospital every day, the other one put you there. When the detective came to take my formal statement at the rehabilitation facility, I told her everything. Not just the shove itself, but the years of financial manipulation leading up to it. The constant demands for money. The guilt trips when I refused. The way they'd isolated me from the rest of the family when I didn't cooperate. I told her about Heather's comment while I was lying at the bottom of those stairs in pain. I told her I wanted to press charges. All of them. Whatever she could make stick. She nodded and took careful notes on everything. Then she explained something I hadn't fully understood before. What Brandon did wasn't just simple assault. Given my age and the severity of my injuries, it qualified as felonious assault in the state of Ohio, a second-degree felony with serious prison time attached. And Heather, standing there encouraging the situation and making demands while I was clearly injured without calling for help, could potentially be charged as an accomplice and for obstruction. I gave the detective everything she needed to build a case. Permission to access my complete medical records, names of neighbors who might have security cameras, my cell phone records showing when they arrived and left. Everything I could think of that might help. Here's where it gets really interesting. My neighbor Frank had installed one of those Ring doorbell cameras last year after some packages went missing from porches in our neighborhood. His camera had a wide enough angle that it captured a clear view of my front porch and most of my driveway. It caught Brandon and Heather arriving that Sunday afternoon, walking up to my door like everything was normal. More importantly, it caught them leaving roughly 3 minutes after they would have pushed me down those stairs. The timestamp proved they hadn't stuck around to help me or call for an ambulance, or do anything a normal person would do after witnessing an accident. And Heather? She was laughing about something as she got in their car, smiling and laughing while I was lying on a concrete floor with broken bones. The detective also obtained their cell phone records through a warrant. In the days immediately following the incident, Brandon and Heather had exchanged dozens of text messages, trying to coordinate their story and get their lies straight. Texts about how they should say, "I tripped and fell on my own because I was clumsy." Texts about how they should claim I was confused or disoriented and didn't really remember what happened. Texts discussing whether they should get ahead of things by telling family members that I might be developing dementia or early Alzheimer's. All of it documented in their own words, saved forever on their phones and in cloud backups. But the real kicker? The thing that turned this from a family dispute into a clear pattern of criminal behavior? They'd done similar things before. The detective did some digging into both of their backgrounds and found gold. Heather's elderly aunt had filed a police report 2 years earlier, claiming that Heather had threatened her with unspecified consequences after she refused to change her will to leave more money to Heather. The aunt had eventually dropped the charges, probably pressured by family members who wanted to keep things quiet and avoid embarrassment. But the report was still in the system, still documented, still admissible. And 3 years before that, Brandon had been formally accused of shoving a coworker during a workplace argument about a project he'd mishandled. The company's HR department had documented multiple witness statements. The company settled quietly with the injured coworker and terminated Brandon, rather than deal with criminal charges or a civil lawsuit. Another incident, another pattern. Another time, my son put his hands on someone and got away with it, because people covered for him. A history of violence, a pattern of targeting vulnerable people for money, a willingness to hurt them when they didn't cooperate. Brandon was arrested at his apartment 2 weeks after the incident, while I was still in the rehabilitation facility doing my daily exercises. Katie sent me his mugshot that evening. He was crying when they put the handcuffs on him, apparently. Looked lost and confused, like he still couldn't understand how his actions could possibly have real consequences. Like this was all some terrible misunderstanding that would get sorted out once he explained his side. Heather was arrested the same day at her workplace in front of her co-workers. She was charged as an accomplice to felonious assault and separately charged with tampering with evidence based on those text messages where she'd coached Brandon on how to lie. Her mugshot showed pure fury. Even in that police photo, you could see the rage radiating off her face. She wasn't sorry for a single thing she'd done. She was just angry that she got caught and that her plan hadn't worked out. The trial was 8 months later, after various delays and legal maneuvering. I had to testify, which was one of the hardest things I've ever done. Sitting on that witness stand in a courtroom full of strangers, looking directly at my son in his orange prison jumpsuit, describing how he'd shoved me down those stairs, describing what Heather said while I lay there injured, watching his face the whole time. The defense attorneys tried everything to paint me as a vindictive father, punishing his son for marrying a woman I didn't approve of. They brought up every instance where I declined to give them money, trying to make me look stingy and unsupportive. They suggested maybe I'd exaggerated my injuries. Maybe I'd tripped on my own and was just confused about what happened. But the evidence was overwhelming, and the defense couldn't explain any of it away. The medical records with detailed surgical reports, the security footage with clear timestamps showing them leaving without helping, the text messages in their own words planning how to lie about what happened, the prior incidents establishing a clear pattern of violent behavior when they didn't get what they wanted. The prosecutor laid it all out methodically, piece by piece, like building a brick wall around them that they couldn't escape. Brandon was convicted of felonious assault with a specification for targeting a victim over 60. The judge called his behavior a betrayal of everything family is supposed to mean. Said she'd rarely seen such a clear case of elder abuse by a family member. Heather was convicted of complicity to felonious assault and separate counts for tampering with evidence and obstruction of justice. The judge had even harsher words for her. Said she'd not only encouraged the violence, but actively worked to cover it up, and showed zero remorse throughout the entire proceedings. Brandon got 4 years in state prison. Heather got 3 years in a women's facility. The day they were sentenced, I sat in that courtroom watching them get led away in handcuffs. Brandon was crying. Heather was stone-faced and furious. My daughter Katie squeezed my hand. That was 7 months ago. Update. All right, Reddit. You asked for an update, so here's what's been happening since the sentencing. I'm doing better now. Much better than those first few months. The hip healed up pretty well considering my age and the extent of the damage. The doctor said I was lucky the fracture didn't need a full replacement. I still use a cane sometimes when the weather turns cold or damp, but most days I can get around fine on my own. Katie moved back to town temporarily to help me during the worst of the recovery. And honestly, having her around has been the best thing to come out of this whole nightmare. We've gotten closer than we've been since she was a kid. 3 weeks ago, Brandon asked me to visit him at the prison. He'd been writing letters for months, the usual stuff about accountability classes and personal growth and being a changed man. I decided to go, not to forgive him, not to hear his apologies. I went to tell him what I'd done while he was locked up. The prison visiting room was exactly what you'd expect from the movies. Plastic chairs bolted to the floor, vending machines with overpriced junk food, guards posted at every door watching everyone like hawks. Brandon came out in his orange jumpsuit looking 10 years older than the last time I'd seen him at sentencing. Prison will do that to you. He sat down across from me and immediately launched into his rehearsed apology speech about how the accountability classes had opened his eyes, and he finally understood what he'd done wrong, and he was a completely changed man now. I let him finish his whole prepared statement. Didn't interrupt, didn't react, just sat there and let him get it all out. Then I started talking. I told him I'd sold my house, got $410,000 for it, all cash, quick closing. The buyers were a nice young couple expecting their first baby who fell in love with the neighborhood. I moved into a nice 2-bedroom condo closer to Katie and the grandkids. Lower maintenance, better security, no basement stairs to worry about. I told him I'd updated my will with my lawyer. Katie gets everything. Every penny, every asset, every possession. Brandon's name isn't anywhere in that document. He gets nothing, not a single cent when I'm gone. I told him I'd also filed a civil lawsuit against him and Heather while they were incarcerated and couldn't do anything about it. Their assets were frozen pending the outcome. Their car got repossessed because nobody was making the payments. Their apartment lease got terminated for non-payment, and their stuff got put in storage, where it's been racking up fees they can't pay. I told him that Heather's parents, who'd been grudgingly making payments on her car out of embarrassment, stopped doing that the moment they saw the lawsuit filing. They didn't want any part of it, and they definitely didn't want to get dragged into court. I told him that when he gets out in 3.5 years, he'll have absolutely nothing waiting for him. No wife, since Heather filed for divorce last month and listed him as the cause of all her problems. No savings because there never were any. No credit because it was already trashed. No family support because he burned every bridge. And I told him that Katie already got the paperwork filed with the court to ensure he can never come within 500 feet of her kids. My grandkids will grow up never knowing their uncle, and that's exactly how it should be. Brandon just sat there staring at me while I laid it all out. The color drained completely from his face. I don't think he'd realized until that